Have you ever felt as if something inside you was silent, even when everything around makes noise, as if there were an answer that never comes, a peace that is never complete, a direction that always escapes at the last moment? It's a strange, almost invisible but constant feeling, like an emptiness that does not scream, it just remains. And the more time passes, the more it becomes part of the routine, as if it were normal to live without understanding the reason for certain pains, certain cycles that repeat themselves without explanation. There are nights when the mind does not slow down, when thoughts come back like old echoes, memories, doubts, decisions that seem not to have been fully resolved. Time passes, but some questions are still there, intact, as if they were waiting for the right moment to be answered. And in the middle of it all, there is that feeling that is difficult to explain, that there is something beyond, something greater, something that you have not yet been able to access. What if I told you that there is, yes, a key, something real, present, but that almost no one notices? Something that has always been available, hidden not by distance, but by lack of understanding. A kind of spiritual code, simple in appearance, but deep enough to completely change the way you see your own life. It's not something new. In fact, it is as old as Jesus' own words, but it has been forgotten, ignored, left aside over time. Because there is a promise, and it doesn't depend on what you feel today, nor on what you've lived so far. For I know the thoughts which I think of you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you the end you are waiting for. Jeremiah 29:11. That promise is still alive, active, waiting to be understood in the right way. And maybe what you need is not more effort, nor more external answers, but access to something that has already been released, but has not yet been fully understood. Today, something will be revealed here. Not as a theory, but as a living truth. And if you stay until the end, you won't just understand, you will feel it. And maybe, even today, something inside you begins to change. And as you continue, you begin to realize that this is not just another content, but a path being revealed step by step, as if each part is organized to touch exactly areas of your life that have been forgotten or hurt. Here you will find teachings that show how God acts even when everything seems confusing, how He directs when there is no clarity, and how He restores what seemed lost. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. John 8:32. There is something being prepared for you to understand, something that can bring peace where there was once unrest and certainty where there was doubt. And as you linger, something begins to line up inside. And maybe that's no coincidence. If this message has already started to speak to you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because this simple gesture can reach other people who also need to find that same direction. And it is exactly at this point that many get lost, because when silence comes, the first feeling is of abandonment, as if God had moved away or stopped listening. But what few realize is that God's silence is never empty. It is always loaded with intention. Moses came to this place without realizing that he was being led. He did not enter the desert as a chosen one, but as someone fleeing, carrying guilt, fear, and the feeling of having failed. And maybe this sounds familiar, because there are times when life seems to spiral out of control, and all that's left is a dry scenario with no clear answers. The desert has no applause, no visible direction, no obvious signs. But there is something that transforms everything. It is there that God begins to speak in a different way. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, and the bush was not consumed. Exodus 3:2. Notice this. The briar has always been there, common, simple, part of the landscape. But at that moment, something changed. What was common has become supernatural, and here there is a detail that many ignore. God did not start by speaking loudly, he called attention first. The fire that did not consume was an invitation, a sign that something different was happening, but it would only be understood by those who were willing to stop, observe, and approach. Moses could have gone on his way, distracted, tired, focused on his own thoughts. But he decided to look again, and it was in this second look that everything began to change. How many times has God tried to get your attention in simple ways, but you were too busy to notice? How many times did something seem small, but it carried a direction that could change everything? The problem is not that God does not speak, it is that we often expect something great, while he begins in the detail, in the silence, in the almost imperceptible. And when God finally speaks, he doesn't ignore human frailty. Moses answered with insecurity, with doubts, trying to explain why he was not able. And maybe you've done it too. Feeling that the call is too great, that it is not strong enough, that it is not prepared. But God's answer was never based on Moses' ability, but on his presence, because when God directs, he sustains. The desert then ceases to be a place of loss and becomes a place of alignment. It is where identity is reconstructed, where fear begins to lose strength, and where the invisible begins to become real. It's not fast, it's not comfortable, but it's necessary. Because before leading others, Moses needed to understand who he was before God. And maybe what you're living now isn't a delay. It may be exactly the process that is preparing you for something bigger than you realize. If this message found something inside you, if it made sense in a way that is difficult to explain, maybe it's not by chance. And if, deep down, you felt this touch, write in the comments, Amen. Because sometimes a simple answer is the beginning of a transformation that you can't even see yet. And as the desert reveals who you are becoming, there is another battle going on in silence, deeper, more hidden. The one that no one sees, but that influences everything. Because there are pains that don't appear on the face, but shape thoughts, reactions, and even decisions without you realizing it. And it is exactly at this point that this promise begins to touch something even more sensitive, the healing of the soul. When Jesus arrives in the region of Gadara, he meets a man who had already been forgotten by everyone. A man living among graves, isolated without control over himself, dominated by forces he could not overcome. That wasn't just a physical or emotional problem. It was an invisible, deep prison that stole his identity little by little. And perhaps at different levels this will also happen today. People living, working, smiling, but inside carrying conflicts that no one understands. For he said unto him, Come out of this man, thou unclean spirit. Mark 5:8. Look at this carefully. Jesus didn't start by treating behavior. He went straight to the root. Because true transformation does not happen when you try to alleviate the symptoms, but when what is hidden is confronted by the truth. That man had long since lost control. Chains didn't work. Human attempts failed, and everything around pointed to an unsolved case. But Jesus did not see an end. He saw someone who could still be restored. And that's what changes everything. God doesn't see you for the current state, but for the purpose that is still alive, even if it is hidden under layers of pain. There are prisons that do not make noise, but are repeated in cycles. Thoughts that come back, emotions that seem to have no explanation, reactions that you would like to control but can't fully manage. And little by little, this creates the feeling that nothing changes, that it will always be like this. But this encounter in Gadara reveals something powerful. No condition is definitive when there is a real encounter with Jesus, because he doesn't just set you free, it gives back dignity. That man who lived isolated, wounded, and lost after the meeting is seen in perfect consciousness, in peace, with a new identity. This wasn't just an external change, it was a complete restoration from the inside out. And maybe what you need today is not to hide what you feel better, nor to try to control everything by yourself. Perhaps it is to allow that which is deepest to be reached by the truth. Because healing begins when that which was hidden finally finds the light. If that word is awakening something within you, as if it were a silent call for change, comment now. Speak, Lord, thy servant hears. Write as an open prayer, as if deciding to go one step further. And leave your like on this video, because this gesture can take that same message to someone who also needs to be restored. And after the soul begins to heal, a silent question arises that many avoid facing. Where do I go back now? Because it is not enough to be freed from pain. It is necessary to find the path again. And it is exactly here that the promise deepens, revealing something that goes beyond inner restoration, the reconnection with the origin, with that which should never have been lost. The parable of the prodigal son is not just about someone who has erred. It's about someone who has disconnected. He had everything. He was in the right place, with identity, direction, and provision. But at some point, he decided to go it alone, believing that he could build his own happiness away from his father. And at first, it all seemed to make sense. Free choices, open paths, own decisions. But time has revealed something that has always been hidden. Freedom without direction turns into emptiness. Maybe it touches something inside you, because there are times when life seems to go on normally on the outside, but inside there is a feeling that is difficult to explain, as if something essential was missing. It is not the absence of things, it is the absence of meaning. And that's exactly what that son began to feel when everything that seemed enough stopped filling. And then, at the lowest point, when there was nothing left but the consciousness of error, something changes. He does not find an external solution. He remembers. He remembers who he was, where he came from, what he had lost. And this memory turns into a decision. And he arose and went to his father. And while he was yet a great way off, his father saw him and was moved with compassion. Luke 15:20. There is something powerful at this moment. The father did not wait for explanations, did not demand justifications, did not impose conditions. He ran. Even before any words, there was already acceptance. This reveals a profound detail that many have not yet understood. God is not waiting for you to become perfect to get closer. He is waiting for you to decide to come back. The estrangement never erased the identity of that son. It only distorted his perception. And maybe that's what happens to many today. They have not lost who they are. They have just forgotten. They forgot the value, the purpose, the connection that gives meaning to everything. And that's why they try to fill it with other things, other paths, other choices. But nothing completely fits in. The return is not an act of shame. It is a reunion with the truth. This is when everything begins to align again, when confusion gives way to clarity, and emptiness begins to be filled from the inside out. Because God doesn't just take it back. It restores, repositions, and returns what seemed lost. And maybe without realizing it, you're already on that way back. Perhaps this message is exactly the turning point that was missing. And if, deep down, something inside you recognizes this, write in the comments a simple but true phrase, "I return to you." Sometimes, a sincerely stated decision is the first step to starting all over again. And when someone decides to come back, like that son who found his way again, something begins to change inside. But there is another level of this journey that few understand. The right time to act. Because it's not enough just to feel, it's not enough just to perceive. There comes a time when you have to respond, and it is precisely here that the story of Noah reveals one of the most ignored, but also most urgent teachings. Noah lived in a time where everything seemed normal. People followed their routines, made plans, built their lives as if nothing was going to change. And it is precisely in this apparently stable scenario that God speaks something completely out of logic. There were no visible signs. There was no natural evidence. There was no collective confirmation. There was only one direction and a choice. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, was afraid, and for the salvation of his family, he prepared the ark. Hebrews 11:7. Notice the depth of it. Noah did not react to what he saw. He responded to what he heard. And that changes everything. Because most people wait for evidence to act, wait for clear signs, wait for everything to make sense before taking a step. But Noah decided to obey when there was still nothing going on. And here is the point that many ignore. When God communicates something, it will not always be understood by those around him. As Noah built the ark, he was likely questioned, discredited, perhaps even ridiculed. Because obeying before visible time requires something that goes beyond logic. It requires spiritual discernment. How many times have you felt like you had to make a decision, change a direction, interrupt a cycle? But did you postpone it, waiting for the perfect moment? How many times did that inner voice speak subtly, but you chose to ignore it because it didn't seem urgent enough? The problem is that there are moments that do not come back. There are decisions that, when ignored, close doors that do not open in the same way again. God's urgency is not based on pressure. It is based on purpose. He does not rush for no reason, but neither does he repeat indefinitely what has already been revealed. Noah understood this. He didn't wait for the rain to start to act. He built it before. And that's exactly what preserved everything. The ark wasn't built in a day. It was a process. A sequence of decisions aligned with a direction that few understood. And maybe that's what's happening to you right now. Small signs, small perceptions, small concerns that seem simple, but carry something bigger behind them. Because God always speaks before acting. The question is, who is really listening? If you've made it this far, it may not be by chance. Perhaps there is something being lined up within you right now, something that will still make sense in the next few moments. And at the end of this video, we're going to go into a time of prayer, a real moment of connection, where all of this is no longer just understanding and turns into experience. So stay with me until the end, because what is being prepared can strengthen your faith in a way that you have not yet experienced. And there is something even deeper that needs to be understood. Because it is not just a matter of listening, nor just of obeying at the right time. There is a moment when everything changes so intensely that there is no way to go back to who you were before. It's the kind of encounter that not only touches, but interrupts, repositions, and completely redefines the course of an entire life. Saul was someone convinced. He believed in what he did, defended his ideas firmly, walked safely within what he considered right. To human eyes, he wasn't lost. He was determined. But that's exactly what makes this story so impactful. Not all certainty means the right direction. And it was in the middle of the way, without warning, without preparation, that everything happened. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying unto him, Saul, Saul, why dost thou persecute me? Acts 9:4. That moment wasn't symbolic. It was real, direct, impossible to ignore. Saul had no time to argue, no space to justify. That meeting did not come to adjust details. Came to transform everything, and perhaps what draws the most attention is not only what happened at that moment, but what happened after it. Because when someone has a true encounter with Jesus, there is no middle ground. Something inside changes definitively. Saul, who once persecuted, becomes someone willing to lay down his life for the same truth he fought. This is not a superficial change. It is not behavior being adjusted. It is identity being reconstructed. And here's one of the greatest hidden teachings. God doesn't just work to improve who you are. It can completely transform who you have become over time. How many people live stuck in their own past, believing that they have gone too far, that they have made too many mistakes, that there is no turning back. But this story proves otherwise, because if there is something that is beyond the reach of grace, then this transformation would not have happened. And yet it happened, in an immediate, intense, and irreversible way. And maybe you've never had a moment so impactful, or maybe he did, but he didn't understand what it meant. Because sometimes God doesn't come with noise, but when he decides to truly reveal himself, he leaves no doubt. It confronts, awakens, repositions, and what comes after that is a choice to continue as before, or allow this transformation to continue to the end. The strongest thing about all of this is that Paul's life became a living testimony, not only for the words he preached, but for the history he carried, because no one can deny a truly transformed life. And that's what impacts. It is not only what is said, but what is lived. And maybe somehow this message is reaching you at exactly that point, as a silent invitation to something deeper, more real, more transformative. If this made sense to you, state in the comments, "Lord, I receive your teachings." Write it as a delivery step, and leave your like, because this simple gesture can make that same message reach someone who also needs to live this transformation. And after an encounter that transforms everything, a need is born that many only realize with time. How to continue listening to the voice that changed everything. Because it is not enough to have a remarkable moment, it is necessary to develop sensitivity to recognize when God continues to speak. And it is here that Samuel's story reveals something profound and often ignored. Samuel was just a boy when he began to hear a voice calling his name in the night. It was not an atmosphere of agitation. There were no crowds. There was no external pressure. It was silence. And even then, he didn't recognize it right away. He listened, but did not understand. He replied, but to the wrong person. This reveals something very important. Not every spiritual experience is understood the first time. "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." 1 Samuel 3:10. That phrase wasn't automatically born within him. It was learned. Samuel needed guidance to discern that this voice was not ordinary. It was not human. It was not the fruit of his own mind. It was God speaking. And this connects directly with today's reality. Because God continues to speak, but the great challenge is not in the absence of the voice. It is in the difficulty of recognizing it. There are many noises competing for attention. Racing thoughts, constant worries, daily distractions. All this creates a kind of barrier that prevents spiritual sensitivity from developing. How many times have you had a strong impression about something, a direction that seemed clear for an instant, but was soon drowned out by doubts or distractions? How many times could a decision have been different if that perception had been taken more seriously? The problem is not lack of direction. It is often a lack of attention. Samuel was in the right place, but he still needed to learn to listen. And this shows that discernment is not something automatic. It is something that is built with practice, with willingness and intimacy. The closer you get, the clearer your voice becomes. The more you ignore it, the harder it becomes to notice. There is also an important detail. God's voice does not come to confuse, but to align. She can confront, she can challenge, she can take you out of your comfort zone, but it always carries clarity and purpose. The problem is that we often expect something extraordinary when God begins with something simple, direct, and personal. And perhaps at this moment, something within you is being adjusted, as if certain pieces began to fall into place in a silent but real way, as if you were beginning to realize that God never stopped speaking. I was just waiting for you to learn to listen. If this message is already touching your heart, understand that this is no coincidence. God communicates in ways that go beyond what meets the eye, and if you felt anything different when you heard these words, that's already a sign. Now, you can be a part of something bigger. When you leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, that message reaches others who also need to hear that voice. Do this now, and allow this current of faith to continue reaching more lives. And the more you begin to discern God's voice, the more you realize that it won't always take you down easy paths. Often, it positions you exactly where your faith will be tested, because listening is an important step, but staying true to what was heard, it's what defines everything. And it is here that Daniel's story reveals a level of faith that does not bend, does not negotiate, and does not change, even when the cost seems too high. Daniel lived in an environment where everything pressed against his faith. The laws were contrary, the people around him did not share the same conviction, and yet he did not adapt his principles to fit. He didn't look for a way to make it easier. He remained, and that bothered him. Because a firm faith exposes that which is unstable around us. The decree was clear: anyone who prayed to any other god would be thrown into the lion's den. There was no room for interpretation, there was no room for negotiation. It was a direct choice between giving in or staying, and the most impressive thing is that Daniel didn't make a spectacle of it. He just kept doing what he always did. He did not change his spiritual routine because of external pressure. This reveals something profound. True faith is not born in crisis. It is revealed in it. Daniel did not become faithful at that moment. He already was. The pit only exposed what was already built inside it. My God sent his angel and shut the mouths of lions. Daniel 6:22. This statement does not only speak of deliverance, speaks of authority. For God did not prevent Daniel from being thrown into the pit, but went in with him there, and this completely changes the way we see difficulties. Divine protection is not always to avoid the problem. It is often to sustain you within it. How many times have you felt pressured to let go of something you believe in, just to avoid conflict or consequences? How many times has the environment around you tried to shape your decisions, making it seem like standing firm was too big a risk? The story of Daniel shows that there is a kind of faith that does not depend on the setting. It remains regardless of what happens around it. And there is a detail that cannot go unnoticed. The grave seemed to be the end, but it became the scene of the miracle. That which was designed to destroy ended up being the place where God's faithfulness was manifested in a visible way. Because when someone decides not to trade their faith, God responds with presence, and maybe, somehow, you're facing your own grave right now. A moment where everything seems to press against what you believe in. But this message did not reach you by chance. It carries a reminder: God does not lose control, even when the situation seems out of control. If while you were listening to this, someone came to your mind, someone who needs that strength, that protection, that intervention, write that person's name in the comments. It can be someone close, someone far away, but you feel you need prayer. By doing so, you connect to a current of faith that doesn't stop here. And together we present these names before God, trusting that something can begin to change. And when faith remains firm, even in the face of pressure, something begins to reveal itself more clearly. God's promises are not bound by time, nor are they limited by circumstances. They exist above human logic, beyond what the eye can see. And this is exactly what the story of Abraham and Sarah exposes so profoundly and at the same time so disconcertingly, because, humanly speaking, everything was past time. The years advanced, the body no longer responded in the same way, and what once seemed possible began to become unlikely, to the point where it seems impossible. And maybe it touches directly on something that you've lived or are still living. Promises that seemed alive, but that over time were set aside, not because they no longer made sense, but because the scenario began to say the opposite. But there is a question that breaks this logic and completely changes the perspective. Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Genesis 18:14. This question does not require an answer. It requires a change of vision, because the limit was never in God. It has always been in the way human beings see time and possibilities. Abraham received a promise when it still made sense to believe it. But the real test wasn't at the beginning. It was halfway through, when nothing seemed to happen. And that's exactly where many give up, not because they have stopped believing completely, but because they begin to doubt in silence, adjusting their expectations so as not to be disappointed again. Sarah, at one point, even laughed, not out of disrespect, but because reality seemed too far from the promise. And how often does this also happen today? A silent, internal laugh, as if thinking, "This is no longer for me." But God did not cancel what he said. He didn't go back. He didn't change his mind. He didn't adjust the promise to human time, because when God declares something, he is not reacting to the present. He is already seeing the future. And this is what renews hope. It is not ignoring reality, but understanding that it is not the final word. The promise does not depend on the perfect scenario, nor on the ideal conditions. It depends on who made it. And when this truth begins to be understood, something changes inside. Anxiety loses strength, doubt begins to recede, and hope ceases to be a fragile expectation and becomes a firm conviction. Maybe what you've been waiting for has already exceeded the time you imagined. Perhaps looking at it now, everything seems too far away, but this message carries a clear reminder: God's timing doesn't work out like yours, and what seems overdue may be being prepared accurately, because trusting is not just believing in what God can do, it is resting in what he has already said. And if you've made it this far, there's a reason. None of this is by chance. This message may be just the answer you needed to hear right now. So stay until the end, because there is still something being prepared, something that can deeply touch your heart and strengthen your faith in a way you didn't expect. And when the promise seems far away and faith has been tested to the limit, there is an even deeper level to that journey. One in which it is not just a matter of waiting or believing, but of standing firm even when everything around you threatens to destroy what you have decided not to negotiate. Because there are times when fidelity to God will not be comfortable, will not be understood, and will often be put to the test in an intense way. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were faced with a simple, but at the same time extreme choice: bow down or face the consequences. There was no middle ground. The order was clear, the decree was absolute, and the pressure was collective. Everyone around gave in, except them. And this reveals something powerful. Staying faithful often means being alone for a moment, but what impresses me most is not just their decision, it is the conviction with which they responded. They didn't negotiate. They didn't ask for more time. They didn't try to adapt the situation. They knew who they believed in, and even without a guarantee of immediate release, they decided to stay. This completely changes the way of seeing faith, because it is no longer based on results and becomes based on conviction. And then the furnace was heated, more than normal, more than bearable, more than imaginable. This also carries a deep meaning, because sometimes the pressure increases just when you decide not to give in, as if the intensity of the evidence were proportional to the firmness of his position. But it is at this point that something supernatural happens. "Behold, I see 4 men loose, walking through the fire and suffering no harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God." Daniel 3:25. Look at this carefully. They weren't just surviving, they were walking. The fire that was supposed to destroy had no effect. What was a death sentence became the scene of divine manifestation. And here's one of the most profound teachings of this promise. God doesn't always keep you from entering the furnace, but He decides to come in with you. And when He is present, the environment loses its power to destroy. The fire is still fire, the situation is still real, but the authority that operates there is greater. There are levels of intimacy with God that are not accessed in times of comfort. They are revealed when everything seems otherwise, when the only thing that sustains them is the certainty that you are not alone. God's presence does not eliminate the reality around you, but it completely transforms the impact it would have on you. And maybe you're going through a moment like that right now, where the pressure has increased, where circumstances seem too intense, where the silent question arises, how long? But this story makes something clear. The furnace is not the end. It can become the place where God reveals Himself in a closer, more real, more undeniable way. Because when His presence manifests itself, even what seemed impossible begins to lose strength. And what was to destroy, it becomes living proof that there is something greater sustaining each step. And if there is something that deeply confuses the human heart, it is when pain comes from where it is least expected. When the rejection does not come from strangers, but from those who were close, from those who knew their story. Because in this kind of moment, it's not just the situation that hurts, it is the meaning it carries. And it is exactly there that José's trajectory begins to reveal one of the most difficult secrets to accept, but also one of the most powerful. Joseph had dreams. They were not ordinary dreams. They were clear visions of something that was yet to happen. But the problem is that not everyone around was prepared to understand this. What should generate support, generated envy. What should bring you closer has created distance. And before he could see any fulfillment of the promise, he was betrayed, sold, discarded as worthless. And maybe it touches on something profound. Because there are times when it seems that life takes a completely opposite turn from what you believed, as if everything was going wrong at the same time, as if each step leads farther, not closer to what was promised. Joseph ended up in a place he did not choose. Then he was wronged again, accused, arrested, forgotten. And here's the finer point. In none of these moments did there seem to be any sign of purpose. Everything indicated delay, loss, injustice. But what he didn't see, it was that God was working in silence. Because there is a construction that happens away from the eyes, in layers that the mind cannot understand immediately. Every phase, every pain, every injustice, it did not interrupt the purpose. It only repositioned Joseph within it. This completely changes the way we see suffering. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Genesis 50:20. That statement didn't come at the beginning, came later. It came when everything made sense. And this reveals something essential. There are answers that only appear when the process is complete. How many times have you tried to understand something ahead of time? How many times have you judged a situation as negative without realizing that it was preparing something bigger? Not all suffering is a sign of deviance. In many cases, it is exactly the path that leads to the right positioning. Joseph did not arrive at the place on purpose despite what happened. He arrived because of what happened. Every detail, even the most difficult ones, was used as part of something bigger. That doesn't mean the pain wasn't real, but it means that it was not in vain. And maybe you're at a stage where it doesn't make sense yet, where the pieces seem disconnected, where the answers have not yet arrived. But this story carries a silent reminder: God does not lose control of the processes that He Himself has allowed. If that word has found something inside you, even if you don't understand everything yet, just trust it. And if in any way this touched your soul, write in the comments, "I trust in God." Sometimes a simple statement can be the first step in seeing what is still being prepared. And there is a level of pain that goes beyond what words can explain. A pain that is not limited to a moment but extends, repeats, accumulates. It is when losses do not come alone, but in sequence, as if everything was being ripped away at the same time. And it is exactly in this place that the story of Job takes us, to a territory where faith is not comfortable, where hope is not obvious, and where understanding God becomes one of the greatest challenges. Job was not someone far from God. He had a life of integrity, a history built with care, a family, possessions, stability. But unexpectedly, everything began to fall apart. First, what he had, then what he loved. And finally, even his own health was affected. And perhaps the hardest thing was not just losing, but not understanding why. Because when the pain doesn't make sense, it weighs even more. And it is at this point that many break down, not only because of the circumstances, but because of the questions that remain unanswered. Why did this happen? Where is God? Why the silence? And the deepest of all, is it still worth trusting? Job also faced these thoughts. He felt, questioned, suffered, but it did not sever its connection with God. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the last upon the earth. Job 19:25. This statement did not come at a time of relief, came in the midst of pain. And this reveals something extraordinary. True faith does not depend on the absence of suffering. It remains even when everything seems otherwise. There is a consolation that is not in the immediate explanation, but in the constant presence. God didn't answer all of Job's questions at that time, but he did not abandon him either. And perhaps this is one of the hardest truths to accept, but also one of the most transformative. Not every answer comes in words. Some come in the form of sustenance. How many times have you waited for a clear answer, a quick solution, an immediate change, and received silence? But what if, even in silence, God is still present? What if the absence of response is not abandonment, but part of a process that you still can't see? Job's pain was not ignored. It was crossed. And in the end, not only was there restoration, but there was a level of understanding that he never had before. Because there are things that are only revealed after going through the complete process. Maybe you're in a moment like that right now, where the answers have not yet arrived, where the weight is still real, where understanding seems distant. But this story leaves a reminder that can't be ignored. Trusting God doesn't require you to understand everything. It requires you to recognize who He is, even when everything seems uncertain. And if you're here so far, that's no accident. There is something being worked on within you, something that is still taking shape. So don't leave here before the end, because what is yet to be revealed can bring exactly the strength you need to continue. And after going through moments where the pain has no explanation and the silence seems too prolonged, an almost inevitable need arises within the human heart, the need for confirmation. Not because faith has ceased to exist, but because at certain moments the weight of responsibility or decision seems too great to carry alone. And it is exactly at this point that Gideon's story reveals something extremely human and at the same time deeply spiritual. Gideon did not see himself as someone capable. When God calls him, he does not answer with assurance, but with doubts. He looks at himself, at his reality, at his limitations, and everything seems incompatible with what is being asked. And maybe this also sounds familiar, because there are times when you feel that there is something bigger being directed at you, but at the same time, that silent question arises. Is it me? If thou wilt yet deliver Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. Judges 6:36-37. Gideon was not rejecting the call. He was trying to understand. He needed something that would confirm what he could not yet hold alone within himself. And here's an important detail that many confuse. There's a difference between asking for signs out of unbelief and seeking confirmation with a heart willing to obey. Gideon did not ask for signs to flee. He asked to make sure he wasn't moving in the wrong direction. And God, in his mercy, answered. This reveals something profound about God's disposition. He knows human limitations. He understands fear, insecurity, the weight of decisions, and at specific times he offers confirmations that do not replace faith, but strengthen the path that is being trodden. But these confirmations do not come to create dependence. They come to boost, because there comes a time when Gideon needs to stop asking for signs and start acting. And this is the point of balance that many need to understand. God confirms, but also expects movement. How many times have you asked for a sign, a direction, a confirmation? And maybe you even received it, but still hesitated. How many times did something inside you already know the way, but the fear of making mistakes spoke louder? Gideon's story shows that God does not abandon those he calls. It empowers, strengthens, and leads step by step. And perhaps, looking back, you can already see moments when God responded in simple but clear ways. Small details, coincidences that didn't seem like coincidences, directions that came up unexpectedly. But at the time you may not have recognized it, because the signs are not always grandiose. But they are enough for those who are willing to understand. And if that word reminded you of something, of a time when you felt that God was directing you, then don't ignore it. Recognize it. Because sometimes confirmation has already come. It just needs to be accepted. And if deep down you feel that God has been good, even in the details that no one sees, write in the comments, Amen. Not as an automatic word, but as a sincere acknowledgement that even without understanding everything, you can see that he never stopped caring. And after so many individual processes, personal encounters, decisions that seem lonely, a truth emerges that completely changes the way of living the faith. No one was called to walk alone, because there is a force that only manifests when lives connect in the same direction, when hearts align with the same purpose. And this is exactly what the early church so powerfully reveals. They weren't perfect. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't live an easy reality. But there was something different. They were together, not just physically, but spiritually connected. And all that believed were together and had all things in common. Acts 2:44. This goes beyond proximity. It speaks of unity, a unity that was not based on interests, but on faith. And this unity generated something that cannot be ignored: demonstration. Miracles happened, lives were transformed, God's presence was perceptible, because when there is spiritual harmony, the environment changes. Faith ceases to be just individual and becomes collective, creating a force that goes beyond personal limitations. How many times have you felt tired, overwhelmed, trying to keep your faith alone, as if everything depended on you alone? The truth is that this was not the plan. The spiritual walk was never designed to be isolated. When someone moves away from communion, little by little they lose strength, lose sensitivity, lose direction. Not because God has moved away, but because he has disconnected himself from a source of strengthening that he himself has established. Communion protects. It strengthens in difficult moments, corrects when necessary, sustains when faith weakens. There is something powerful about being surrounded by people who share the same pursuit, the same faith, the same desire to grow spiritually. Because when one weakens, the other sustains. When one rejoices, everyone celebrates. And this creates an environment where no one has to fight alone. But this unity does not happen by chance. It requires willingness. It requires making space, trusting, allowing yourself to walk together. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges today, because it is easier to close yourself off than to expose yourself. It is more comfortable to isolate yourself than to connect. But isolation never strengthens. It weakens in silence. The early church understood something that many are still learning. When people come together with purpose, God manifests himself with intensity. His presence is not limited to one place, but is revealed in a special way where there is true unity. And maybe you're realizing now that you don't have to carry everything yourself, that there is a lighter, stronger, more complete path when you decide to connect. And if you have come this far, there is something being awakened within you. This word is not common. It is not just another message. It carries direction. So stick around until the end, because there's still something being revealed, something that can strengthen your walk in a way that you haven't experienced yet. And in the midst of this collective construction, where faith is strengthened in communion, a responsibility arises that few immediately perceive, because it's not just about walking together, but about positioning yourself when no one else gets up. There are moments in history when silence becomes dangerous, when doing nothing is already a decision in itself. And it is exactly in this scenario that Esther's life reveals one of the deepest and most challenging callings. Esther did not arrive at the place where she was by chance. She was strategically positioned, even without fully understanding why. And this connects with something that often goes unnoticed. You are not always where you are, just for you. Sometimes there is a greater purpose involving other lives. When the threat arose against the people, what was at stake was not just a personal decision, it was the destiny of many. And at that moment, Esther had to face a truth that changes everything. She could choose to preserve herself or take a stand. Who knoweth whether thou hast come to this kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4:14. This question was not just an encouragement, it was an awakening. Because there are times when God calls someone specific to act, not because that person feels ready, but because he was placed right there for it. And the strongest thing is that this call does not come with guarantees of comfort. It is often accompanied by risk. Esther knew that by presenting herself before the king without being called, she could lose her own life. Still, she decided to go. This reveals something essential. Intercession is not just talking to God. It is to take a stand in the face of circumstances, even when it requires courage. There is an invisible force in intercession that connects what is happening here with what can be transformed into the spiritual. It's not just a religious practice. It is an action that opens paths, that changes scenarios, that frees up interventions that naturally would not happen. How many times have you felt a weight in your heart for someone? A concern that didn't leave my mind, a name that came back repeatedly, a situation that seemed to call for an answer? Often this is no coincidence. It can be a silent call to intercede, but interceding goes beyond words. It involves responsibility. It involves understanding that at certain times God chooses someone to place himself in the gap, to represent, to act spiritually in favor of others. And this requires sensitivity to perceive and courage to respond. Esther didn't just change her own story. It changed the destiny of an entire people, because he decided not to be silent, because he understood that his position was not just a privilege, it was a mission. And maybe, somehow, you're being called to something like that right now. Maybe not in the same way, but with the same principle. Not to ignore what you feel, not to be silent in the face of what needs to be done, not to back down when it's time to take a stand, because there are moments that define destinies. And the answer to that call may be exactly what will transform not only your story, but that of many other lives. And after understanding the weight of a position like Esther's, another truth emerges that touches even deeper. Because the biggest challenge is not always in what happens around us, but in what happens inside us. There are times when it is not an external threat that needs to be faced, but an internal mistake that needs to be acknowledged. And it is exactly here that David's life reveals one of the most powerful paths of transformation. David was not someone far from God. He had history, he had intimacy, he had deep experiences. But even then, in a moment of weakness, he failed. And it was not a small mistake, it was something that brought real consequences, which affected not only his life, but that of others. And maybe that's hard to face, but it's also real. No one is immune to failing. What makes this story so remarkable is not just the error, it is the way David responded to him. Because there are people who try to hide, justify, ignore. But David did the opposite. He exposed, acknowledged, and stood before God without masks. "Create in me, O God, a clean heart, and renew in me a right spirit." Psalm 51:10. This is not a common phrase. It is a deep cry. It is not someone asking only to alleviate the consequences, but someone who wants to be transformed from the inside out. And this reveals the essence of true repentance. It is not just feeling guilty. It is to desire change. How often do people confuse regret with remorse? Remorse weighs, bothers us, but does not transform. True repentance, on the other hand, repositions, changes direction, alters consciousness. He doesn't just look at the mistake. He looks at who he has become because of him and decides not to continue on the same path. David understood that the biggest problem was not just what he did. It was what needed to be restored within him. And that changes everything, because transformation begins when the root is treated, not just the effects. And maybe, at some point, you've also faced something like this. A decision, an attitude, a path that, looking at it now, you know was not the best. And along with that, there may have been the weight, the guilt, the desire to go back, but this story reveals something that cannot be ignored. The mistake does not have to be the end. It can be the beginning of something new. When there is sincerity, when there is surrender, when there is a real willingness to change, God does not reject, it restores. He renews, he rebuilds. But this renewal does not happen on the surface. It happens in the depths, where no one sees, where only you and God know what is really being transformed. And maybe right now, something inside of you is being touched in this way, as a silent invitation to leave behind what no longer makes sense and allow something new to begin. And if this message has reached you, think about how many people are also in need of something like this, a word that brings direction, hope, and a new beginning. By liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and activating the bell, you help this message reach those who need it. And in some way, you also become part of that greater purpose, bringing light where there is still doubt. And when transformation begins within, it inevitably manifests itself outside. Because a life aligned with God cannot remain silent in the face of what is misaligned. And it is exactly at this point that Elijah's story becomes so impactful, because it reveals what happens when someone decides not to live divided, but totally positioned. The scene around Elijah was one of spiritual confusion. People had not completely abandoned God, but neither were they fully committed to him. They lived in a kind of middle ground, oscillating between the right and the convenient, between the truth and what seemed easier. And this kind of environment is dangerous, because it creates a false sense of balance, when in fact there is a silent disconnection going on. Elias appears exactly in this context, not as someone popular, but as someone aligned. And that makes all the difference, because spiritual authority does not come from position, nor from human recognition. It is born of intimacy and obedience. And when someone is truly aligned with God, their voice carries weight, carries direction, carries truth. How long will you limp between two thoughts? If the Lord is God, follow him. 1 Kings 18:21. That wasn't just a question, it was a direct confrontation. Elijah did not bring a comfortable message, he brought clarity. Because there are times when the greatest act of love is not to soften the truth, but to reveal it directly. And perhaps this is one of the most challenging points of this journey. Choose a side definitively, because living divided seems easier, avoids conflicts, reduces pressures, but it also hinders spiritual growth. There is no depth where there is indecision. Elijah showed that a single person, completely aligned with God, can alter an entire environment. He didn't need a majority. He didn't need approval. He just needed to be right before God. And that was enough for the supernatural to manifest itself in an undeniable way. But this kind of authority does not appear overnight. It is built on the secret, on daily obedience, on the choices that no one sees. Before Elijah stood up before everyone, he had already stood before God. And this brings an inevitable reflection. It's not about what you say publicly, but about how you live when no one is looking, because that's where true alignment happens. Maybe today there is an area of your life that is still divided, a decision that has been postponed, a direction that has not yet been fully assumed. And this message does not come to accuse, but to align, because clarity liberates even when it confronts. And when this alignment happens, something changes not only within you, but around him too, because a positioned life becomes a reference, becomes light, becomes an instrument of transformation. And so, little by little, what seemed confusing begins to take shape, and what was once a doubt begins to become direction. And when the alignment happens and the decision is made, something starts moving in the unseen, because there are prisons that are not visible to the eye, but that control thoughts, emotions, and even the way a person sees their own life. And this is exactly what the story of the liberation of the people of Israel reveals so strongly. Not all slavery is in chains. Many are in the mind. The people lived for years in Egypt, trapped in a system that not only oppressed them physically, but also shaped their identity. They didn't just work like slaves, they began to think like slaves. And this is one of the deepest levels of oppression, because when someone loses sight of who they really are, they start to accept as normal what they should never be. But there comes a time when God intervenes, not because the people had enough strength to break free, but because there was a greater promise about them. And this reveals something essential. There are battles that you don't win alone. There are situations that require the direct action of God. When they finally leave Egypt, what seemed like liberation quickly turns into tension. In front, the sea. Behind, the enemy army. No visible way out, no logical path, no human solution. And it is exactly at this point that many would go back, that they would give up, that they would believe that there was no more hope. But it is in this scenario that a powerful truth is released. The Lord will fight for you, and you will hold your peace. Exodus 14:14. This completely changes the dynamic, because victory would not depend on their strength, but on trust in God. How many times have you felt this way, surrounded by situations that seem to have no way out, problems that pile up, thoughts that press, circumstances that seem bigger than you can handle? And the natural tendency is to try to solve everything, to look for an immediate way out, to act on impulse. But this story shows something different. There are times when the greatest attitude is to trust. The Red Sea did not open before the need. He opened up at just the right moment, and this reveals that God not only liberates, He also leads. What seemed like an absolute limit became a path. What seemed like the end turned into a passage. And when the people cross, it's not just a change of place, it is a change of identity. They cease to be slaves and start walking as free. And this is profound, because true liberation does not happen only when leaving a place. It happens when you start to see yourself differently. Maybe there are areas in your life where you still feel stuck. Patterns that repeat, thoughts that limit, situations that don't seem to change. But this message carries a truth that cannot be ignored. God still opens paths where there is no way out. And if it somehow spoke to you as a reminder that you're not alone in this battle, write in the comments, "God cares for me," not just as a phrase, but as a statement of confidence in the midst of everything you are facing right now. And after understanding that God opens paths where there is no way out, an even deeper revelation emerges. Because even when you go across, even when you win certain battles, there are still areas that don't seem to change, limitations that remain, weaknesses that are still present, situations that do not disappear as you expected. And it is precisely here that Paul's experience reveals one of the most powerful secrets of this promise. Paul was no ordinary. He had deep encounters with God, received extraordinary revelations, lived spiritual experiences that few have achieved. And yet, there was something about him that remained as a constant limitation. He called it a thorn in the flesh, something that bothered him, that limited him, that he would like to see removed. And as anyone else would, he asked God to take it away. It wasn't once. It wasn't something superficial. It was a sincere request, repeated, loaded with expectation. But the response he received was not what he expected. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." 2 Corinthians 12:9. This completely changes the logic, because naturally we think that power manifests when everything is strong, when there are no limitations, when everything is aligned. But God reveals the opposite. His power is most intensely manifested right where weakness exists. This does not mean that pain does not exist, that limitation is not real, but it does mean that she does not have the final say. Paul was not freed from that, but it was sustained through that. And this reveals something that many have not yet understood. Not everything that remains in your life is there to stop you. Some things are there to connect you even more with God. How many times have you felt limited by something, a weakness, a difficulty, an area where it seems like you're never strong enough? And maybe that already made you think that you couldn't go further, that you couldn't live something bigger. But this story shows exactly the opposite. The limitation did not defeat Paul's purpose. It strengthened, because it kept him dependent. And this dependence was not weakness. It was the place where God's power was most clearly manifested. There's something powerful about recognizing that you can't do it alone, because it is at this moment that the space is opened for the supernatural to act. As long as someone believes they have control of everything, they live limited to their own reach. But when he understands that he needs God, something bigger begins to happen. And maybe there's an area in your life where you still struggle with it, trying to solve, trying to change, trying to control. But what if, instead of fighting alone, you allowed God to act right there? Because it is in surrender that power manifests itself. This is when you stop relying only on your own strength and start depending on something bigger. And if you've made it this far, there's a reason. What you're hearing right now may not make complete sense yet, but something is being prepared. So stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed may be exactly the answer you were trying to find without even realizing it. And after understanding that even weakness can become a point of connection with God's power, an even deeper dimension of this journey emerges. A dimension that does not depend on circumstances, recognition, or extraordinary moments. It's the place where it all really begins, even if no one sees it. Because before any visible manifestation, there is a secret place where decisions are made, where identity is established, and where God's voice becomes clear. Jesus' own life reveals this in an undeniable way. Before every miracle, before every word that impacted crowds, before every important choice, there was a constant pattern. He withdrew. He sought silence. He withdrew from the crowd to be alone with the Father, and that was not a detail. It was the basis of everything. But when you pray, go into your closet, and when you have shut your door, pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you publicly. Matthew 6:6. This instruction is not just about a physical place. It's about a posture. It's about choosing a space where there's no distraction, where there's no appearance, where there's no need to prove anything to anyone. Because in the secret, there is no audience. There is no external validation. There is no comparison. There is only you and God. And that's exactly why this place becomes so powerful. Because there, the masks fall. There is no need to maintain an image, to sustain an expectation. It is where the truth appears most clearly, where the heart reveals itself as it really is. And it is in this environment that transformation begins in a genuine way. Many seek deep experiences, clear answers, direction for life. But they ignore this place. They want public results without building intimacy in the secret, and this generates a shallow, unstable faith dependent on circumstances and emotions. Because without roots, there is no support. The secret is where the roots go deeper. It is where faith ceases to be just something that is talked about and becomes something that is lived. It is where God's voice begins to be recognized more easily, not because he speaks louder, but because the noise around it decreases. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges today. Find that space. In the midst of so many distractions, so many worries, so many constant stimuli, stopping seems difficult. Muting feels uncomfortable. But it is exactly in this silence that something begins to line up, because it is not a ritual, an obligation. It is about relationship. To be with God without haste, without a script, without appearance. To allow this encounter to shape thoughts, feelings, decisions. And the most interesting thing is that what happens in secret inevitably manifests itself, not as an effort, but as a consequence. The strength that sustains in difficulties, clarity in decisions, peace in the midst of chaos. All of this is born in this place where few enter, but where everything begins to change. And the more you deepen this intimacy in the secret, the more something begins to change in the way you face what is around you. Because it is no longer just a matter of enduring situations, but of exercising authority over them. And this is exactly what is revealed when Jesus is in the boat with the disciples, crossing a scene that to human eyes seemed completely out of control. The storm was not small, the wind was strong, the waves were crashing with intensity, the boat was beginning to be taken by the water. And the most interesting thing is that those men were not inexperienced. Many of them knew the sea. They had faced difficult situations before, but at that moment, fear took over. Because there are storms that go beyond experience, they reach a level where everything seems to get out of control. Meanwhile, Jesus was asleep. This detail is profound. In the midst of the chaos, he was at peace. Not because he was ignorant of reality, but because he was above it. And this reveals something essential. True peace does not come from the absence of problems. It comes from an inner place that is not shaken by what is happening outside. When the disciples wake him up, it is not just a request, it's desperate. They no longer knew what to do. And it is at that moment that Jesus gets up and does something that completely changes the scenario. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be still, be still." And the wind was still, and there was a great calm. Mark 4:39. He didn't ask, he didn't negotiate, he didn't try to control little by little. He ordered. And this reveals a dimension that many have not yet accessed: spiritual authority. An authority that does not come from human effort, nor from attempt, but from alignment with God. Because when someone is truly connected, the invisible responds. The disciples looked at it without understanding, because until then, they were reacting to the storm. Jesus, however, confronted the storm, and that changes everything, because there are situations in life that won't change as long as you just react to them. They require positioning. And perhaps, in many moments, what you call an external problem is a reflection of something internal. Fear, anxiety, insecurity, all of this amplifies the storms. But when there is alignment with God, something settles inside you that does not shake easily. That doesn't mean the wind will stop immediately, but it does mean that he will no longer have the same power over you. Spiritual authority is not about controlling everything around. It's about being firm on the inside, to the point of not being dominated by what's on the outside. And from that place, decisions change, words gain weight, and even the environment begins to respond differently. Because when there is alignment, there is a response. When there is connection, there is authority. And what once seemed impossible to control is beginning to give way. Maybe there is a storm in your life today, something that has taken away their peace, occupied their thoughts, generated restlessness. But this message brings a reminder: you were not called only to endure. He was called to take a stand. And if at that moment there is something in your heart that needs intervention, don't keep it to yourself. Write in the comments what you would like to put before God, as a sincere request, as an open prayer, because when there is unity in faith, something powerful happens. And what seemed impossible begins to find an answer. And after understanding that there is spiritual authority to confront storms, an inevitable question arises. What activates this authority in practice? Because it's not enough to know, it's not enough to feel. There is a point where everything turns into action, and it is exactly at this point that Peter's story reveals a principle that completely defies human logic. Peter had spent the whole night trying. It wasn't for lack of effort, it wasn't for lack of experience, it wasn't for carelessness. He did everything he knew, applied everything he knew, and the result was none. Empty nets, accumulated fatigue, silent frustration. And maybe that sounds familiar because there are times when you do everything right, and yet nothing happens. And it is precisely in this scenario that Jesus appears, bringing a direction that, humanly speaking, made no sense. To go back to the sea to cast the nets again, after a whole night without result, what would be the logic of this? What would be the guarantee that it would be different now? And Simon answered and said unto him, Master, having labored all night we have caught nothing, but on your word I will cast the net. Luke 5:5. This answer carries something profound. Peter did not deny his reality. He recognized the fatigue, the frustrated attempt, the negative history. But even so, he decided to comply. And this is exactly where something changes, because true obedience does not depend on guarantees, it depends on trust. How many times have you stopped acting because you weren't sure of the outcome? How many times have you waited for a clearer signal, a stronger confirmation, greater security, before taking the next step? The problem is that many miracles are not blocked by a lack of declared faith, but by the absence of action. Peter could have argued more, he could have postponed, he could have ignored that direction, but he did something simple. He acted. And this decision, apparently small, made room for something completely out of the ordinary. The miracle did not begin when the fish appeared. It began the moment he decided to obey. And that completely changes the perspective, because often the focus is on the result, when in fact the turning point is on the decision. Immediate obedience breaks cycles of frustration, breaks repetitive patterns, and activates something that cannot be accessed by logic alone. And maybe there is a network in your life today that you have tried to cast several times. An effort that doesn't seem to pay off, an area where you've done everything, and therefore the tendency is to give up, stop, not try again. But what if the difference isn't in the effort, but in the direction? Because when action is based only on logic, it is limited to the natural. But when it is based on the Word of God, it accesses the supernatural. And little by little, you begin to realize that it's not about understanding everything first. It's about trusting enough to take the next step. And it is in this movement that something begins to open up, even if you still can't see it completely. And when obedience makes room for the supernatural, something even deeper begins to be revealed. Because it's not just about what God does for you, but who you become from that encounter. And it is exactly here that the story of the Samaritan woman reveals one of the most transformative secrets of this entire journey. She was not there by chance. He went to the well at an unusual time, avoiding people, avoiding looks, carrying a history that spoke louder than any attempt at a new beginning. His life was marked by rejection, by decisions that left marks, by a constant search to fill something that never seemed complete. And maybe that sounds closer than it sounds. Because there are voids that are not visible, but are deeply felt. And it is in this scenario that Jesus approaches. He doesn't start with accusations. He doesn't expose harshly. He doesn't reject. He talks. But at the same time, it leads that dialogue to something much deeper than it seemed. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never thirst, because the water that I will give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. John 4:14. This speech goes beyond the natural. It touches directly at the root of human search, because often what seems to be an external need is actually an identity crisis. The person tries to fill with relationships, achievements, recognition, but nothing sustains for long. And the cycle repeats itself. Jesus reveals that the problem is not only in the choices, it is at the source. And as long as the source is external, temporary, unstable, thirst will always return. And at that moment, something begins to change. Not just because she heard different words, but because she was seen differently. Jesus revealed the truth about her life, but not to condemn, but to reposition. He showed her who she was, but mainly who she could be, and that transforms everything. Because when someone understands their true identity, the past loses the power to define the future. That woman who avoided people becomes someone who runs to announce. The one who carried shame starts to carry a message. This wasn't just a change in behavior, it was a complete redefinition of identity. And perhaps deep down, many of the struggles you face today are not just external. They can be linked to the way you see yourself, to what you believe about yourself, based on what you have already lived, what you have already made mistakes, what you have already lost. But this message reveals something that changes everything. Your identity doesn't have to be defined by the past. It can be revealed in the present through who God says you are. And when that truth starts to come in, something adjusts inside. The search changes, the choices change, the way of living changes, because you stop trying to find yourself in empty places and begins to live from a source that does not run out. And if Somehow this word made sense to you, as if something inside had been touched differently. Write in the comments, God chose me, not just as a phrase, but as a truth that begins to be assumed from now on. And when the identity begins to be restored, another silent challenge arises that many try to avoid, because it's not about what they did to you, but about what you decide to do with it. There are marks that do not appear on the outside, but that remain trapped inside, influencing feelings, thoughts, and even the way of living. And it is exactly at this point that the cross reveals one of the most profound and difficult teachings to practice. Jesus was being wronged, betrayed, humiliated, rejected, carrying a pain that was not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. And yet, in the most intense moment, he releases a statement that breaks all human logic. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Luke 23:34. This is not common. It's not natural. It's not something that is born of emotion. It is a spiritual decision, because true forgiveness does not depend on the other acknowledging the mistake. It does not depend on an apology. It does not depend on reparation. It is born from a level of consciousness where you understand that carrying it longer will only imprison you. How many times has someone hurt you, said something that was marked, taken an attitude that changed everything? And even if time has passed, does it still weigh heavily? Sometimes it's not something you talk about, but it's something you feel. A discomfort, a memory, a reaction that comes without warning. And this happens because the lack of forgiveness creates an invisible connection with what should have already been left behind. Forgiveness does not change what happened, but it changes the power it has over you. Jesus did not wait for everyone there to understand what they were doing. He did not condition forgiveness on a human response. He simply released it. And in doing so, he showed that forgiveness is not about deserving. It's about liberation. Many believe that to forgive is to accept the mistake. It is to agree with what has been done. But that's not it. To forgive is to decide that it will no longer control you. It is to break a chain that many times no one sees, but that arrests. And maybe there's something inside of you that's still attached to it. A situation, a person, a memory that has not yet been completely released. And as difficult as it may seem, this decision may be just what is missing for you to move forward lightly. Because while you hold on, something also holds you back. But when you let go, something breaks, and little by little, the soul begins to breathe differently. The mind calms down, the heart aligns, and the past loses the strength it had. Not because it ceased to exist, but because it ceased to dominate. And that's one of the deepest keys to that promise. You don't have to carry forever what God has already given you the ability to release. Maybe you've been waiting for an answer for a long time, trying to understand why certain things haven't changed yet, and that may be the key that was missing. So stay until the end, because what is yet to be revealed can bring you exactly the freedom you need to move forward. And once you understand that forgiveness releases that which was trapped within you, a force arises that begins to move differently. A faith that no longer accepts limits as the final answer, because there is a point where believing is no longer just a feeling and becomes an attitude. And this is exactly what is revealed when that paralytic is brought to Jesus. He couldn't walk. He depended on others to move, to arrive, to try any change. And all around him, there were real obstacles. A full house, a crowd blocking the entrance, a scenario that naturally would say, it can't. And many people given this would accept it. They would return home, postpone, give up once again. But something different happens. The man's friends did not take the limit for an answer. They didn't argue with the crowd. They didn't wait for a perfect opportunity. They created one. They climbed on the roof, made room where there was no way, and lowered that man exactly where Jesus was. This is not common. This is faith in motion. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Mark 2:5. Look at this carefully. Jesus didn't just see the need, he saw faith. A faith that did not stand still, that did not settle down, that did not accept impossibility as definitive. And this reveals something profound. True faith is not passive. She acts, insists, finds ways, even when everything seems closed. How many times have you come across situations that seem to have no solution? Closed doors, blocked paths, answers that never arrive. And little by little, this will try to convince you that there is no point in trying anymore. But this story shows otherwise. The impossible begins to give way when someone decides not to stop. Those men could have made several excuses. They could have said that it was not the time, that it was too crowded, that they would try another day. But they chose to act at that moment, and this decision made all the difference, because the miracle did not begin when the paralytic was healed. It started when someone decided not to give up. And maybe there is something in your life today that seems to be stuck, a situation that he has tried in various ways, a path that seems blocked, and the natural tendency is to retreat, accept, leave it for later. But what if what is missing is not more time, but a different attitude? Because when faith becomes practical, it breaks boundaries. It creates access where there was none. It opens up possibilities that were not visible. And that doesn't depend on perfection. It depends on the decision. And little by little you begin to realize that what seemed impossible was not the end. It was just the beginning of something that had not yet been accessed in the right way. And if this message reached you, it was not by chance. There is something being awakened within you right now, something that can change how you react to situations. And to continue receiving this kind of direction, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every word can be exactly what you need at the right time. And when faith becomes practical and begins to break down barriers, a silent risk arises that many do not realize, that of confusing what God is doing with his own merit. Because as something begins to happen, as doors open and results appear, the heart can slowly incline to a dangerous place, pride. And it is exactly here that the life of John the Baptist reveals one of the surest secrets to staying aligned. Jerome had everything to occupy a prominent place. He was followed by crowds, respected, listened to, recognized as someone different. His message impacted, his presence drew attention, his life had authority. And in many cases that would be enough for someone to establish themselves as a center, as the main reference. But Jerome saw it differently. When people started to compare, when questions arose about who was bigger, who should be followed, he didn't try to defend himself. He didn't seek to maintain his position. He didn't get into dispute. He replied with a clarity that reveals a deep level of understanding. It is necessary that he should increase and that I should decrease. John 3:30. This statement is not common because it goes against the natural impulse. The world teaches you to grow, to appear, to stand out. But John understood something that changes everything. Growing up the wrong way can take you away from the purpose. The humility he showed was not weakness. It was alignment. He knew exactly who he was. He knew what his function was, and so he didn't try to occupy a space that didn't belong to him. And this is liberating, because when someone understands their role, they don't need to compete, they don't need to prove, they don't need to force recognition. How many times do people get lost, trying to be seen, trying to validate their own worth through external approval? And without realizing it, they begin to act out of purpose, just to maintain a position that was never theirs. This generates weariness, confusion, emptiness. John didn't need that. He had enough security to decrease because he knew that his importance was not in the spotlight, but in the faithfulness to what God called him to do. And here is one of the most important points. Pride blocks God's action because it puts the I at the center. Humility, on the other hand, makes room because it recognizes that everything comes from Him. This does not mean decreasing in the negative sense, but positioning yourself correctly. It is to understand that the value is not in appearing more, but in being aligned, because when God exalts, there is no human effort that needs to sustain. True exaltation does not come from self-promotion, it comes from divine recognition. And maybe at some point you felt the pressure to prove something, to show value, to be recognized. But this message brings an important adjustment. You don't have to occupy a place that wasn't prepared for you. When there is humility, there is lightness. When there is alignment, there is peace. And when God is placed at the center, everything finds its place. And so without forced effort, without dispute, without comparison, growth happens in the right way, at the right time, sustained by something that does not depend on human approval. And when humility places the heart in the right place, something even more subtle needs to be developed: discernment. Because not every difficulty that arises is just an ordinary circumstance of life. There are times when what's happening isn't just external. It is a direct confrontation with spiritual principles. And this is exactly what is revealed when Jesus is led into the desert. He wasn't lost, he wasn't out of purpose. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And yet, in that environment of apparent emptiness, silence, and vulnerability, targeted attacks arise. This reveals something that many do not realize. Being on the right path does not mean the absence of confrontation. It often means the opposite. The enemy does not appear in an obvious way, does not come with something clearly wrong. It uses distortion. He takes what is true and tries to present it in an altered form, out of context, to generate doubt, confusion, and above all, deviation. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Matthew 4:4. This answer of Jesus shows the central point of everything. He did not react based on emotion, nor on immediate need. He answered with the truth, and that made all the difference. How many times does a situation seem logical, seems to make sense, even seems correct? But deep down, does it carry something misaligned? How many times do thoughts come up as if they were your own, but lead to paths that generate doubt, fear, or confusion? This is how many attacks happen, in a subtle, almost imperceptible way. And without discernment, the person reacts without realizing what is really behind. Jesus did not argue. He did not try to argue based on opinion. He took a stand with the word, because when the truth is clear, the lie loses strength. And this shows that spiritual knowledge is not something optional. It is protection. Discernment does not prevent difficult situations from happening, but it prevents you from being deceived by them. And perhaps this explains why, at certain times, you felt confused without understanding exactly why. It wasn't just what was happening outside, it was something trying to influence from within. But when you start developing spiritual sensitivity, something changes. You start to notice before, to identify patterns, to recognize what is not aligned. And this strengthens his position, because the greatest danger is not the attack itself. It is not realizing that it is happening. And the closer you get to God, the more that clarity increases. His voice becomes more evident, and that which once confused begins to lose its effect. And little by little, you stop reacting in any way, and begins to respond with awareness, with firmness, with direction, because it's not just about overcoming situations. It's about staying aligned in the middle of them, Few people will understand the depth of it, but if you're here, there's a reason. There is something being revealed that can protect your mind, your decisions, and your walk. So stay until the end, because what is yet to come can bring exactly the clarity you need to stay strong, without getting lost along the way. And once you learn to discern what comes from God and what tries to lead you astray, there is an even more subtle, almost invisible key, but extremely powerful. A key that does not begin when the miracle appears, but even before any visible change takes place. And this is exactly what is revealed in the multiplication of the loaves. The scenario was one of scarcity. A hungry crowd, a secluded place, limited resources. When the disciples look at the situation, the reaction is logical. There is not enough. 5 loaves and 2 fishes make no sense in the face of so much need. And perhaps this is one of the most common reactions. Look at what is missing, calculate what is not enough, conclude that it is not possible. But Jesus does something completely different. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes and lifted up his eyes to heaven and blessed them. Luke 9:16. Before any multiplication, there was gratitude. He did not ignore the limitation. But he wasn't stuck with it either. He chose to be grateful for what there was, even if in human eyes it was little. And this detail changes everything, because it reveals a principle that many have not yet understood. Gratitude is not a response to the miracle. It can be the beginning of it. How many times have you put off thanking, waiting for something to happen first, hoping to improve, hoping to solve, hoping to change, to only then recognize? But this teaching shows the opposite. When you focus only on scarcity, your vision is limited. You see only the problem, only what is missing, only what does not work. But when gratitude comes in, something changes inside you. It repositions the heart. It adjusts the way you see. It opens space to perceive what previously went unnoticed. And more than that, it creates an environment where the supernatural can act. Jesus did not wait to see the result to give thanks. He thanked him, and then the result began to manifest itself. And maybe that's exactly what's missing in some areas of your life. No more effort, no more trying, but a change of attitude. Because gratitude does not deny reality, but chooses not to be dominated by it. Even when it seems little, even when it doesn't make complete sense, there is still something that can be recognized. And when that happens, the mind calms down, the heart aligns, and something starts moving differently. Because that which is placed in God's hands with gratitude, it never stays the same. And little by little you begin to realize that it's not just about what you have, but how you see what you have. And this change in itself is already the beginning of something bigger, something that is still forming, even if you can't fully see it right now. And when gratitude repositions the heart and makes room for the supernatural to act, there is still a step that defines whether what has begun will really be completed: perseverance. Because starting something with faith is important, but continuing, even when everything weighs you down, is what reveals the depth of this journey. Jesus' path to the cross was not marked by ease at any time. There was rejection, there was pain, there was abandonment. People who were once close have moved away, voices that were previously supportive have fallen silent, and the path has become increasingly difficult. And yet, he continued, and as they were carrying him away, they took a certain Simon, a Cyrenian, that he might carry the cross after Jesus. Luke 23:26. This detail reveals something very human. There was a moment when the weight was extreme. The body felt it, the path became more difficult, and even so, the purpose was not abandoned. This shows that persevering does not mean not feeling. It means not to stop. How many times have you started something with conviction, with clarity, with direction? But halfway through, did fatigue arrive? The difficulties increased, the answers took time, and what seemed so right at first began to seem distant. It is exactly at this point that many give up, not because they stopped believing completely, but because the momentary wait spoke louder. But Jesus' walk reveals something that changes everything. The purpose is not always easy, but it is always significant. There is something bigger being built, even when it is not visible at the moment. And giving up halfway interrupts what was already in motion. Perseverance is not born of emotion, because the emotion changes. It is born of conviction, from the certainty that, even without understanding everything, there is a greater reason supporting each step. Jesus didn't continue because he was comfortable. He kept going because he knew what lay beyond that moment. And maybe that's what you need to remember right now. There is something beyond the phase you are living. There is something that has not yet been fully revealed, but that is already being prepared. Because standing firm turns sacrifice into victory. And that doesn't mean ignoring fatigue or pretending that everything is fine, but it means deciding not to stop because of it. It means taking another step, even when it seems difficult. It means to continue, even when the will is to retreat. And little by little, what seemed heavy begins to make sense. What seemed like a delay begins to reveal purpose. And what seemed like the end, it turns into greeting. Maybe you're exactly at that point right now, halfway through, feeling the weight, questioning whether it's worth continuing. But this message comes as a clear reminder: don't stop, because what God begins, he does not leave it incomplete. And if, somehow, this word spoke to you as a silent confirmation to continue, write in the comments, "I trust in God's action," not just as a phrase, but as a decision to stand firm, even without seeing everything yet. And when the decision to persevere becomes firm, something even deeper begins to be revealed. Because it's not just about keeping walking, but about understanding which direction that walk is taking you. And it is exactly at this point that the vision of the prophet Isaiah reveals a dimension that completely transforms the way of relating to God. Isaiah was not in an ordinary moment. He was taken to an environment where the presence of God manifested itself in an intense, real, undeniable way. And when contemplating that, there was no comparison with other people. There was no justification. There was no defense. There was recognition. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Isaiah 6:3. Faced with this reality, Isaiah did not look outside. He looked inside, and the reaction was immediate. He realized his own limitation. This reveals something profound, because the closer one gets to God's presence, the clearer one has about oneself. Not to generate condemnation, but to generate transformation. Because holiness is not a distant concept. It is not something theoretical. It is a calling, an invitation to align thoughts, attitudes, choices. And this may seem challenging, because many times the idea of holiness has been associated with rules, restrictions, something heavy. But this view reveals the opposite. Holiness is access. Isaiah was not removed because he recognized his condition. He was cleansed. One touch, one divine intervention, and what was once limitation became the starting point for something greater. This changes everything, because it shows that God does not reject those who approach with sincerity. It transforms. How many times do people avoid getting closer to God because they feel inadequate? Because they think they need to be ready, perfect, adjusted before taking this step? But this story shows that the process happens on the way, not before it. Holiness begins when there is willingness, when someone decides not to stay the same, not to continue in the same patterns, not to accept what is no longer aligned. And this decision opens doors that previously seemed closed, because there is a dimension of God's presence that is only accessed when there is alignment, not out of obligation, but by connection. That's when thoughts start to change, when choices start to be made more consciously, when the heart starts to look for what really matters. And in this process, something happens naturally. The purpose begins to become clearer. Directions that once seemed confusing begin to line up. Decisions that seemed difficult are beginning to make sense. Isaiah entered that moment as one who recognized his limitations. And he left as someone sent with direction, with purpose, with clarity. And perhaps that is exactly what is being built now within you, not just to continue, not just to resist, but align more deeply, because the closer you get. But everything starts to make sense. And when holiness begins to align the heart and bring clarity about who God is, something inevitable happens. You start to see challenges differently. Because what once seemed impossible begins to be confronted by a new perspective. And this is exactly what the story of David and Goliath reveals so strongly. The scenario was intimidating. On the one hand, an entire army paralyzed by fear. On the other, a giant who stood up every day to challenge, threaten, intimidate. Goliath wasn't just big in size. He was great in the mind of those who observed him. Because the true power of that giant was not only in physical strength, but in the fear it generated. And that's how many giants come into life, such as situations that seem bigger than you, problems that repeat themselves, challenges that intimidate even before they are faced. And little by little, this creates an internal barrier, a silent voice that says, "I can't." But David arrives with a completely different vision. He doesn't ignore the giant. He sees beyond it. "Thou comest against me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield, but I will go against you in the name of the Lord of hosts." 1 Samuel 17:45. This statement is not born of natural courage. It is born of intimacy. David didn't trust his own size, his own strength, his own experience. He trusted in God. And this completely changes the way of facing any situation. While everyone saw an impossible obstacle, David saw an opportunity to manifest something greater, and this reveals a powerful principle. Victory begins with how you see what is in front of you. How often does a problem grow just because it was fueled by fear? How many times does a situation seem bigger than it really is because the mind has already accepted defeat before it even tries? David did not allow this to happen. He did not negotiate with fear. He moved forward with conviction. But there is an important detail. That courage did not emerge at that moment. It was built before, in secret, in the moments when no one saw it. It was there that David developed confidence, faced minor challenges, learned to depend on God, and when the giant appeared, he was already prepared inside. And perhaps this is the point that many ignore. It's not about waiting, not feeling afraid. It's about not allowing fear to decide for you. The giants represent everything that tries to paralyze: limitations, insecurities, situations that seem out of reach. But when there is trust in God, something changes. The mind is strengthened, the vision adjusts, and the step that seemed impossible begins to be taken. David did not win when the stone hit the giant. He won when he decided to move forward. And that changes everything, because it shows that the biggest confrontation happens before the action. It happens inside. And little by little, you begin to realize that what seemed too big, it is not greater than that which is with you. Because when God is at the center, even the greatest of giants loses the power to intimidate. And after understanding that spiritual courage allows you to face giants that previously seemed insurmountable, another challenge arises that is often even more silent, that of making decisions. Because it is not only the great confrontations that define one's destiny, but also the choices made in the moments when there is no applause, no visible pressure, just different paths in front of you. And it is exactly here that Solomon's life reveals something extraordinary. Before God, he had a rare opportunity. I could ask for anything: wealth, power, victory over enemies, recognition. Everything was within reach. But instead, he made a request that betrays an unusual conscience. Give your servant a heart understanding to judge your people. 1 Kings 3:9. He didn't ask for results. He asked for the ability to decide. And that completely changes the perspective, because many times people want ready-made answers. They want immediate solutions. They want paths that have already been defined. But what truly transforms a life is the ability to discern correctly in the midst of complexity. How many decisions have you made based only on the emotion of the moment, or only in logic, without considering something deeper? And then, over time, did you realize that it brought consequences that could have been avoided? This is because unwise decisions may even seem correct at first, but they do not support the result. Divine wisdom goes beyond human reason. It sees what is not visible, perceives what is not obvious, brings clarity where there is confusion, and that makes all the difference, especially in times when everything seems uncertain. Solomon understood that governing well was not about having control of everything. It was about knowing how to decide correctly. And when he prioritized that, something surprising happened. He received more than he asked for. Because when the essential is put first, the rest falls into place. This reveals a powerful principle. When you seek direction before you act, you avoid paths that could generate unnecessary pain. And maybe today, you are facing an important decision. Something that requires more than haste, more than impulse, more than attempt. Maybe there is doubt. Maybe there are several options. Maybe the path is not yet clear. But this message brings an essential adjustment. It's not about choosing fast. It's about choosing right. And that clarity doesn't just come from thinking more, comes from aligning more. To seek God, to silence the noise, to allow something deeper to drive that choice, because an aligned decision can avoid years of consequence. And little by little, you begin to realize that you don't have to carry the weight of deciding alone. There is wisdom available, accessible, ready to be received by those who decide to seek. And when that wisdom comes in, what seemed confusing begins to organize, what seemed uncertain begins to gain direction, and what seemed risky begins to make sense. In the next few moments, something even deeper will be revealed. Something that may be exactly the sign you have been waiting for to understand what to do from now on. Be aware, because this can completely change the way you see what lies ahead. And after understanding that divine wisdom brings clarity to decisions that shape the future, an even more intimate confrontation arises. Because even when you know the way, there is still something that tries to stop you from moving forward: fear. And it doesn't just appear in extreme situations. Often it comes just as you're about to step into something new, something bigger, something that demands more from you. That is exactly what happened to Joshua. He was not inexperienced. He had already walked alongside Moses. He had seen miracles. He already knew the presence of God. But now the responsibility was different. He was no longer following. He was leading. And that changes everything. Because taking on a new level brings with it a new kind of pressure. The territory ahead was unknown. The challenges were real. And within him, a silent battle began to form, because fear doesn't need words to act. It settles in thoughts, in doubts, in insecurities that try to make you retreat before you even start. And it is exactly at this moment that God manifests himself with a direct word, with no room for interpretation. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and be of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed. Joshua 1:9. This reveals something powerful. God does not ignore fear, but neither does he allow it to rule. He didn't say that Joshua wouldn't be afraid. He said not to surrender to him, Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is a decision. How many times have you felt like you had to move forward, but something inside tried to stop you? A thought telling you that it's not the time, that you're not ready, that it can go wrong. And little by little, this creates an invisible barrier, preventing you from entering territories that have already been prepared. But this word brings an essential adjustment. If it was God who directed it, then it is not fear that should decide. And there is a detail that completely changes the way of facing this. God didn't just give a command, He gave a guarantee. His presence would be with Joshua. This transforms everything because it means that he would not need to rely only on himself. And perhaps this is the point that many have not yet realized. Fear grows when you think you're alone. But when there is awareness of God's presence, something changes within you. Insecurity loses strength, doubt decreases, and the step begins to be taken. The new will always generate discomfort. The unknown will always challenge. But staying where it's safe isn't always staying where it's purpose. Joshua had to decide between retreating or advancing. And that decision wasn't based on how he felt, but in what God had said. And maybe you're right in that place right now. In the face of something new, feeling the weight of responsibility, perceiving fear trying to speak louder. But this message arrives as a clear direction. Move forward, because when God guarantees the presence, the path, even challenging, already carries everything that is necessary to be traveled. And when courage conquers fear and you decide to move forward, something even deeper begins to be tested. Not just how much you believe, but how much you trust. Because there is a silent difference between saying that you trust God and living totally dependent on Him. And that's exactly what the widow's story reveals in such an impactful way. The scenario seemed ordinary. People delivering their offerings, some with a lot, some with little. To human eyes, the comparison was inevitable. Who gave more? Who gave less? Who did something relevant? But Jesus didn't look at the quantity. He looked into his heart. Truly, I say to you, this poor widow has given more than all. Luke 21:3. This completely breaks the natural logic. How could someone who gave so little have given more than everyone? Because the amount was not in what was delivered. It was in what it represented. That woman did not give what was left. It was not a comfortable delivery. It was not something that would not be missed. She delivered what humanly represented her security. And that's exactly what makes this moment so profound, because it reveals a level of confidence that goes beyond words. How often is generosity limited by the fear of lacking? How many times does the mind calculate, secure, retain, trying to ensure control over what can happen? This happens because deep down, there is still a greater dependence on what one has than on the one who provides. But this story reveals a different principle. Generosity breaks the scarcity mentality. When someone decides to give with confidence, something changes inside. It is not just an external act, it is an internal declaration that the source is not in the resource, but in God. And this activates a dimension that cannot be accessed by logic alone. The widow had no visible guarantees. There was no apparent security. There was no surplus. There was no alternative plan. But there was something stronger: trust. And that trust has turned a simple surrender into a powerful spiritual act. Because generosity is not about quantity. It's about positioning. It's about understanding that everything you have is not the source. It is provision. And when this becomes clear, attachment decreases, fear loses strength, and freedom begins to grow. And perhaps this is one of the biggest challenges: to give up what seems to guarantee control, to live in a way where dependence is real. Not just in words, but in attitude, because when someone lives like this, something starts to align. Worry decreases, peace increases, and provision is seen differently, not as something uncertain, but as something that comes from a constant source. And little by little you realize that what seemed risky, it was actually a way to experience something deeper, because when trust becomes practical, life is no longer guided by the fear of lack and is sustained by the certainty that God never ceases to provide. And when generosity reveals a level of trust that goes beyond what is visible, there is an even deeper point where faith is confronted, not only in what seems difficult, but in what seems closed. Because there are situations that no longer seem to have a solution, no longer seem to have a return, no longer seem to have hope. And it is precisely in this scenario that the resurrection of Lazarus reveals one of the most powerful teachings of this promise. Lazarus was not only sick, he had already died. Time had passed, expectations had ended, and everyone around had already accepted reality as definitive. When Jesus arrives, he doesn't just find pain, finds an already established human conclusion. It's over. And maybe it touches on something profound, because there are areas of life that seem that way, dreams that were left behind, situations that didn't change, answers that never came. And over time, the mind tries to accept there is nothing else to do. But it is precisely at this point that Jesus declares something that breaks all logic. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he be dead, shall he live. John 11:25. This statement does not ignore reality. It redefines who has authority over it. Jesus did not arrive until Lazarus died. He arrived later. And that was not a delay. It was purpose. Because there are times when God allows something to go beyond the human limit to reveal that his power is not conditioned by time or circumstance. When he asks them to remove the stone, there is resistance, there is doubt, there is that voice that says, it is already too late. And how many times does that same voice appear inside you, saying that there is no point in trying anymore, that there is no way out, that it is past the point? But Jesus does not negotiate with this voice. He calls, and when he calls Lazarus, something impossible happens. That which was dead answers. What seemed lost comes back. What everyone had already closed is restored. This reveals something that cannot be ignored. God is not limited by what you see. True hope is not based on the scenario. It is based on who has authority over it. And this completely changes the way we see any situation. Because even when everything seems finished, there is still a word that can reverse. And maybe today there is something in your life that you have already put as lost, something that you have already stopped expecting, you have already stopped believing, you have already accepted as definitive. But this message brings a direct confrontation. It's not because it's over in your eyes that ended for God, because when he enters, what seemed impossible ceases to be a limit, and little by little, something begins to move inside you, not based on what you see, but on what you start to believe again. A hope that does not depend on immediate signs, but on a deeper certainty. And it's that hope that keeps you going, even when there's no evidence. Because they know that there is something bigger going on, even if it is not yet visible. And stay until the end. Because what is being built here is not just a message. It's a meeting. And you can feel something different, something real, something that goes beyond words. And when hope is restored, even in the face of what seemed impossible, something even deeper happens. Because it is not enough just to believe that something can change. There comes a time when this change needs to become real, visible, concrete. And this is exactly what Zacchaeus' encounter with Jesus reveals so intensely. Zacchaeus was not just another person in the crowd. He carried a history marked by wrong choices, by attitudes that distanced him from people, and especially from God. He had a position, he had resources, but inside there was a void that nothing filled. And maybe that sounds familiar, because there are external achievements that cannot touch what is inside, but something inside him was still searching. Even though everything around him says otherwise, he climbs a tree to see Jesus, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. He didn't just want to hear about it, he wanted to see it. And it is at this moment that something unexpected happens. Jesus stops. Look at him. And he calls him by name. That changes everything, because it was not Zacchaeus who found Jesus. It was Jesus who revealed himself to him. Today, salvation has come to this house. Luke 19:9. This statement did not come after a long change, came at the time of the meeting. And this reveals something powerful. Transformation begins when the truth is received in a real way. Zacchaeus didn't have time to create a better version of himself. He didn't try to hide the past. He didn't try to justify what he did. He simply replied. And this response was immediate, practice, visible. He decided to return, restore, correct. This shows that true transformation is not just in feeling, it manifests itself in attitude. How many times does someone hear, feel something strong, get emotional? But nothing changes afterwards. Because the experience was not complete. The truth was heard, but it was not applied. But when there's a genuine encounter, something moves inside that does not allow it to remain the same. And perhaps this is the most important point here. Real change doesn't start outside. It starts within. And when it begins, it is inevitably reflected in the choices, in the decisions, in the way of living. Zacchaeus was not forced. He was not pressured. He was transformed. And that makes all the difference, because when one understands who one really is before God, when one realizes that there is still grace, there is still opportunity, there is still a new beginning, something breaks. The past loses strength, guilt loses control, and a new direction begins to emerge. And maybe, somehow, that message is doing that within you right now, not as information, but as a calling. A call to not only listen, but answer. Because there is a difference between knowing the truth and allow it to transform you. And if at that moment you feel that this word arrived in a different form, as if it were exactly what you needed to hear right now, don't ignore it. Receive it as a sign. And if that truth has found space within you, write in the comments, "I believe, Lord." Not just as words, but as a decision to live this new reality from today. What just touched his heart wasn't just a string of words. It was a calling. A call to step out of understanding and into experience, to stop just listening and start responding. Because every truth revealed so far points to something greater, the need to draw closer to God in a real, sincere, and profound way. It's no longer about what you've understood. It's about what you decide to do with it now. There is a time when knowledge needs to be transformed into delivery. A moment when all that has been awakened within you finds a place of expression. And that place is prayer. It is where the invisible begins to become real, where silence turns into response, where the heart finds direction. Call unto me, and I will answer thee, and show unto thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Jeremiah 33:3. That promise is not far away. It is for now. So allow this moment to be different. Open your heart, without reservations, without filters, and take everything before God. Because it is in this encounter that what seemed like just a message begins to become a living transformation within you. Beloved Father, your presence envelops us now, and your word echoes as living truth within every heart that has come this far. The Lord has promised to be close to all who call upon you in truth, and it is in this certainty that we approach at this moment, with reverence, with thirst, with expectation. The Lord is near to all who call upon him, to all who call upon him in truth. Psalm 145-18. We recognize that we are not alone, that the Lord sees the hidden, knows our silent struggles, and understands what we cannot even express. Lord, we thank you for every teaching revealed, for every truth that touched the soul deeply, for every moment when we felt that you were speaking directly to us. Thank you that your word does not return void, because it transforms, confronts, heals, and directs. Thank you that even when we didn't realize it, the Lord was leading every detail so that we were here now, in this encounter with you. Father, we ask you for strength to live all that has been awakened in us. It gives us courage to obey, wisdom to discern, faith to move forward even when we don't understand everything. Teach us to trust you more than our own thoughts, to depend more on your direction than on the circumstances around us. May every decision be aligned with you. May every step be guided by your presence. Look, Lord, at every need presented now. For those who are tired, bring rest. For those who are confused, it releases clarity. For those facing sickness, he pours out healing. For those who are financially burdened, it opens doors and brings provision. It restores families, rebuilds relationships, strengthens hearts that are fragile. May all anxiety be replaced by thy peace. May all fear be overcome by thy presence. May all doubt give place to a firm and unshakable faith. At this moment, in silence, each heart presents to you what it needs most, that which only the Lord knows completely. Receive, Father, every request, every tear, every thought. We place before you our dreams, our worries, our challenges. We surrender control. We give up trying to solve everything on our own, and we trust that the Lord is in charge. May your will prevail, even when it is not as we imagine, because we know that your plans are perfect. And now, Lord, we rest in that assurance. May your peace, which passeth all understanding, guard every heart and every mind. May your presence accompany each person from this moment on, bringing direction, protection, and purpose. We declare that something new begins here, something that comes from you and that no one can stop. We pray in faith, trusting fully in the name of Jesus. Amen. If this prayer has found a place in your heart, write Amen as a sign of your faith and surrender at this moment. After all that has been revealed, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This message did not come to you by chance. Every teaching, every word, every example carries a living promise, a clear direction, and a direct invitation to transformation. My promise to you is not just a title. It is a spiritual reality being released upon your life now. God chose you to hear this today, to awaken something within you that may have been dormant, to remind you that there is a greater purpose being built, even when you can't see it completely. The question that remains is not whether God is speaking, but if you are willing to answer. What are you going to do with all that you just got? Will it continue in the same way, or will it decide to live this transformation in a real way? And let me tell you something very sincerely. It is an immense joy to have you here, being part of this moment. This is not just a video, it's a connection, it's a journey, and you're an essential part of it. If this message spoke to you, don't keep it to yourself. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet, and activate the bell so you don't miss anything that will still be revealed here. And I really want to meet you too. Right here in the comments of where you are watching, and if you feel in your heart, share a little of what you are experiencing. Your story matters, your life has value, and together we can form a chain of faith, support, and prayer. And look, what you received today is just the beginning. There is something even deeper waiting for you. In the next video, we will dive into an even greater dimension of this spiritual journey, understanding how to live steadily in the presence of God and how to access levels of faith that completely transform the reality around you. Don't miss that, because it might be just the next step you need to take. Allow God to continue speaking to your heart Take the next step on this journey by watching the next video that will appear here on the screen. In it, we will continue to learn how to live in God's presence and experience the fullness of His plans. Don't stop here, because God still has much more to speak to you. Always remember, God is greater, and His presence is our strength. Trust Him, and He will do infinitely more than you can imagine. May God bless your life, and see you in the next video.